April 1969. The heat over North Vietnam was thick enough to taste, a wet, suffocating haze that clung to skin and metal alike. On a narrow strip of concrete hidden deep inside the jungle near Phu Quien Air Base, a shape sat beneath camouflage netting that did not belong to this world. An American F-4 Phantom II. Its gray fuselage was scarred by flak. One wing bore a jagged hole where a 37mm shell had nearly torn it apart. The tail still carried the faded ghost of a U.S. Air Force insignia, hastily painted over with red stars. It had landed there 3 days earlier, limping on one engine after a brutal engagement over Hanoi. Its pilot had not survived. For the Vietnamese and Soviet advisors who now stood around it, the aircraft was more than wreckage. It was a miracle. A fully intact American frontline fighter captured alive. The operation was classified even within North Vietnam. To the Soviets, it was simply known as Project Mirror Fang. And to fly it, they had chosen a man who had never touched an American aircraft before. Major Nguyen Phan Loc was not famous. He had no propaganda posters, no victory parades, no newspaper articles praising his kills. He was something more valuable. He was careful. At 33, Locke had flown more than 600 combat missions in MiG-17s and MiG-21s. He had survived ambushes, missile strikes, and mid-air collisions. He had seen friends burn inside cockpits and watched aircraft disintegrate around him. What made him different was not courage, but restraint. He did not chase kills. He did not fight for glory. He fought to come home. That was why Moscow wanted him. Colonel Yuri Sokolov, a senior Soviet test pilot seconded to Vietnam, watched as Locke approached the Phantom for the first time. The Vietnamese pilot stopped 10 meters from it, eyes scanning the aircraft like a hunter studying an unfamiliar animal. "Your thoughts," Sokolov answered through an interpreter. Locke answered quietly, "It looks heavy." That was exactly the right thing to say. The F-4 Phantom II was the backbone of American air power in Vietnam. Twin engines, 2 crew, radar-guided missiles, long range. It was designed not for dogfighting, but for domination. Where the MiG-21 was a knife, the Phantom was a flying command center. The aircraft had been shot up on April 14th during a large-scale U.S. strike over Haiphong. A MiG-21 had damaged one engine, and anti-aircraft fire had finished the rest. The Phantom's pilot tried to reach the coast, but lost hydraulic pressure. Somehow, impossibly, he had managed to glide the crippled fighter onto a short emergency strip carved out of the jungle. The Americans were captured. The plane was not destroyed. That single failure would change the war. Within hours, Soviet technicians were flown in. The aircraft was disassembled just enough to be hidden, then slowly rebuilt inside a camouflaged hangar. Every system was photographed, copied, and labeled. Radar, missiles, avionics, wiring harnesses, even the ejection seats were removed and studied. But one thing remained missing: a pilot who could survive flying it. The Phantom was not like a MiG. It required coordination between pilot and weapons officer. It demanded understanding of radar modes, fuel transfer systems, and engine management. One mistake could kill everyone aboard. Sokolov made the decision himself. "We will use a Vietnamese pilot. If it crashes, we do not risk a Soviet." Unofficially, he also knew something else. A Vietnamese pilot would understand the sky over Vietnam better than any outsider ever could. Locke climbed into the Phantom with visible discomfort. The cockpit was enormous compared to the MiG's tight, brutal interior. It felt less like a fighter and more like a control room. Hundreds of switches, dials, warning lights, panels for radar, weapons, navigation, engines, fuel, and countermeasures. He sat in the front seat. Behind him, an empty WSO cockpit stared back like a hollow eye socket. "This aircraft was designed for 2, Sokolov said. "You will fly it alone." Locke nodded. "Then it was designed for 2 because it could not trust one man." That unsettled the Soviet engineers. The MiG-21 assumed its pilot was expendable but competent. The Phantom assumed its pilot was human and therefore needed help. That difference would define everything. For 2 weeks, Locke did nothing but study. American manuals captured with the aircraft were translated line by line. He memorized engine start procedures, emergency checklists, radar modes, and fuel balancing protocols. He learned how the Phantom's twin J-79 engines behaved under stress. He learned how the aircraft handled at high angles of attack. He learned how the radar saw targets. It was like learning to fly a battleship. Every evening he returned to his quarters exhausted. "The Americans do not build airplanes," he told Sokolov once. "They build systems that happen to fly." The Phantom could see enemies beyond visual range. It could guide missiles automatically. It could coordinate attacks without visual contact. But it also required perfect power, perfect calibration, and perfect discipline. A MiG could be fixed with a hammer. A Phantom needed a laboratory. That was its power. That was also its weakness. On May 2, 1969, Locke was ordered to bring the aircraft to life. The hangar doors opened. Sunlight spilled across the gray fuselage. The jungle was silent, as if even the birds were afraid. He went through the startup sequence slowly. Battery, fuel pumps, ignition, left engine, right engine. The twin turbines screamed to life, shaking the air. The Phantom came alive beneath him, vibrating with restrained force. This was not the angry growl of a MiG. This was the deep thunder of a machine that expected to rule the sky. "Phantom 1, you are alive," Sokolov said softly over the radio. Locke placed his hands on the throttle. For the first time in history, a North Vietnamese pilot was about to fly the most advanced American fighter of the war, and no one knew whether he would come back.
The F-4 Phantom rolled down the narrow Vietnamese runway like a trapped animal being forced through a tunnel. Jungle pressed in on both sides, the concrete barely long enough for an aircraft that had been designed for enormous American airbases. Luck kept his eyes on the airspeed indicator. 120 knots. 140. 160. The Phantom wanted more. Its engines roared in protest, demanding a longer strip, a wider sky. But there was no more runway left. "Rotate," Sokolov whispered into the radio. Luck pulled back on the stick. The aircraft lurched, hesitated for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, then tore itself free of the earth. The jungle dropped away. The captured American fighter climbed into Vietnamese airspace, its red stars gleaming against the gray fuselage. A ghost had taken flight. At 6,000 feet, Luck leveled out. The Phantom felt nothing like a MiG. It did not dart, it did not leap. It moved with the heavy, deliberate confidence of a machine that assumed it would always have time. He made small corrections. The aircraft responded slowly, like steering a ship through water rather than a blade through air. "This is not a fighter," he said quietly. "This is a command post." Behind him, the empty WSO cockpit glowed with radar screens and navigation scopes, silently waiting for a second mind that was not there. Luck began testing systems. The radar came alive, painting the airspace around Hanoi in green light. He could see mountains, rivers, even clouds. And then, something else. 3 blips appeared at the edge of the scope. American aircraft. They were flying far out over the Gulf of Tonkin, unaware that one of their own machines was now watching them. For the first time, Luck truly understood what the Phantom was. MiGs had to see their enemy. The Phantom did not. The Phantom's secret. The missile system was integrated into the radar. Lock a target, fire. The aircraft did the rest. In a MiG, you fought. In a Phantom, you selected. This is how they kill us, from far away, without ever being seen. Sokolov did not answer. The aircraft could engage multiple targets at once. It could guide semi-active radar missiles with terrifying precision. It was a machine designed to dominate not just the sky, but the entire battle space. But Luck also felt something else: fragility. Every system depended on another. Lose the radar, and the missiles were useless. Lose electrical power, and the navigation vanished. Lose hydraulics, and the aircraft became a falling brick. It was brilliant, and it was brittle. At 15,000 feet, Luck pushed the throttles forward. The Phantom surged, climbing harder now. The Mach meter crept upward. The aircraft passed the sound barrier with barely a shudder. Unlike the MiG, which trembled and screamed at supersonic speed, the Phantom felt calm. It had been built for this. It belonged here. Luck rolled the aircraft gently. The turn radius was huge. A MiG could have danced around it. "This is a bomber that thinks it is a fighter," he muttered. He imagined a dogfight over Hanoi. A Phantom trying to turn with a MiG-21 would bleed energy and die. But at range? At speed? With missiles? The Americans were not trying to outfly their enemies. They were trying to erase them. Sokolov gave the next order: simulate missile launch. Luck locked one of the radar blips far out over the sea. The Phantom's computer confirmed the solution. He pressed the trigger halfway. The aircraft vibrated. A simulated Sparrow missile streaked invisibly toward the target. Hit. Even without weapons, the system told him exactly when an enemy would have died. Luck exhaled slowly. "This is not war," he said. "This is execution." Coming home. Fuel was running low. The Phantom drank it like a beast. Luck turned back toward the jungle airfield. The landing was worse than the takeoff. The aircraft wanted to float. Too fast, and it would overshoot. Too slow, and it would stall catastrophically. At the last second, he dropped the gear and flaps. The Phantom slammed onto the concrete with brutal force, skidding before the brakes finally bit. It stopped less than 20 meters from the jungle. Silence. Sokolov's voice finally came back over the radio. "You flew an American fighter." Luck closed his eyes. "Yes, and now I know why they are so dangerous."
The Phantom was hidden again beneath layers of jungle camouflage, but it no longer felt like a dead artifact. It had flown, and in flying, it had revealed the soul of American airpower. To the Vietnamese mechanics who walked around it in silence, and the Soviet engineers who studied its panels with cold precision, the F-4 Phantom II was no longer just a captured machine. It was a confession. Over the next 3 weeks, Major Gien Van Luck flew the aircraft 6 more times. Each mission was short, carefully planned, and conducted under strict radio silence. The Phantom never left North Vietnamese airspace, but in those tight loops above jungle and mountain, it gave away everything it was designed to be. Luck tested its endurance and discovered that it could remain airborne far longer than any MiG, its fuel and engines built for sustained presence rather than sudden strikes. He tested its climb and found that while it lacked the raw vertical leap of the MiG-21, it possessed an unstoppable momentum, like a heavy freight train that, once moving, could not easily be slowed. He tested its handling in high-speed turns and learned that it hated prolonged dogfights, bleeding energy quickly when forced to maneuver hard. This aircraft was not meant to dance. It was meant to hunt. What astonished him most was not the power, but the way the Phantom thought. Its radar constantly swept the sky, tracking targets far beyond what a human eye could ever see. When Luck locked on to a simulated enemy, the aircraft did not merely show him a dot on a screen. It calculated range, closure rate, and intercept geometry automatically, turning complex air combat into a mathematical certainty. In a MiG, a pilot fought the sky. In the Phantom, the pilot supervised a machine that fought for him. Soviet engineers pushed the tests further. On one flight, they ordered Luck to simulate battle damage. One engine was throttled down. The Phantom shuddered, but kept flying. Then a hydraulic circuit was deliberately cut. Warning lights multiplied across the panel like a spreading infection. Luck struggled to keep the aircraft level, realizing with cold clarity how close the Phantom was to becoming a falling building. A third failure would have doomed it. When he landed, sweat soaked his flight suit. "This machine survives only when everything works," he told Sokolov afterward. "Our MiGs survive when nothing does." Sokolov included those words in his report to Moscow. The Americans, he wrote, had created an aircraft that represented technological dominance rather than battlefield resilience. The Phantom was devastating when supported by secure runways, trained crews, spare parts, radar networks, and command infrastructure. It was less a fighter than a node in a vast warfighting system. Against an enemy who could disrupt that system, it became something else entirely. Luck added his own quiet conclusion. The Phantom was built for a war of control. Vietnam was a war of survival. American intelligence never discovered what had happened. One Phantom was listed as lost. One crew disappeared into captivity. No one in Washington ever knew that their own aircraft had flown again under a red star, that it had watched American formations from inside enemy airspace, or that its secrets had been laid bare by the very people it was meant to destroy. By midsummer 1969, the risk became too great. American reconnaissance flights were sweeping deeper. The jungle airfield was no longer safe. Orders arrived from Hanoi and Moscow alike. The Phantom was to be destroyed. Luck was told to fly it one last time, just long enough to burn off its fuel. He took the aircraft up alone, circling above the green sea of trees, listening to the steady thunder of American engines in a Vietnamese sky. When he brought it back down, he sat for a long moment in the cockpit, surrounded by glowing screens and switches that once ruled half the heavens. He placed his hand on the control stick, feeling the machine's quiet readiness, its unfulfilled violence. "You are not evil," he whispered in Vietnamese. "You are just built for a different kind of war." Explosives were wired into the fuselage. The Soviet engineers and Vietnamese guards retreated into the jungle. Luck watched from a distance as the charges detonated. Fire ripped through the Phantom, tearing it apart in a roar that echoed across the valley. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but twisted metal and blackened earth. Years later, after the war had ended and Vietnam had rebuilt itself from ashes, Luck became an instructor. He trained young pilots to fight Phantoms, Eagles, and every other American machine that might one day return. He never spoke of the captured F-4 in public, but in quiet moments he taught his students a lesson that no manual contained. "Do not fear their aircraft," he would say. "Fear their systems. Break the system, and even the greatest machine becomes blind." When asked once what he truly thought of the Phantom, he answered simply, "It was not a fighter, it was a strategy, and strategies, unlike pilots, can be defeated."